We begin with the fight for democracy in Washington, D.C., where protesters flooded the streets to rally against President Trump's federal police takeover. In a major escalation, Republican governors of 3 states, West Virginia, Ohio, and South Carolina, are set to deploy hundreds of National Guard troops to Washington. And in a reversal of their previous stance, defense officials now say many of those troops will be armed. But the backlash to Donald Trump's extreme agenda is spreading far beyond the nation's capital. Across the country, Americans are rallying against what they see as a sweeping power grab by Texas Republicans, a gerrymandering plan designed to lock in Republican control of the House of Representatives in the 2026 midterm elections. Yesterday, the Democratic National Committee organized hundreds of Fight the Trump Takeover protests in 43 states, according to the event website. The largest demonstrations were in Texas itself and simultaneous rallies in Chicago and Austin. Democrats vowed to use every tool at their disposal to keep up the pressure on Texas Republicans.
Together, we shined a national spotlight on this power grab. Together, we sparked national momentum for California and other states to redistrict and cancel out the 5 stolen seats out of Texas. This is a bipartisan movement with one simple message. Voters should choose their politicians, not the other way around.
And we are going to continue to fight, to raise, to organize, to register, to mobilize. We will fight on the floor of this House. We will fight in the courtroom. We will fight in the streets. Whatever the maps are, we are going to win them in this state.
Joining us now, Ahmed Baba, columnist for The Independent and founder of Ahmed Baba News, and Miles Taylor, former DHS chief of staff during Donald Trump's first term and author of Blowback. Gentlemen, welcome to the weekend. Miles, as I said in the intro, defense officials had initially said that the National Guard troops would not be armed. And now we hear, according to a Trump official, not only will more states supposedly deploy troops to the nation's capital, but they're going to be armed. How far do you see this federal takeover of Washington going?
Yeah, I think they're going to go all the way, Jonathan. I mean, we should
define all the way, Miles.
Yeah. Well, I think that they ultimately want those troops to be the ones who are responsible for law enforcement in Washington, D.C. I think that's what the president wants, because in his view, his chain of command as commander in chief is a lot clearer than what the law says when it comes to home rule in Washington, D.C. and micromanaging the Washington police force. And you're already seeing that in those legal filings where Attorney General Pam Bondi is trying to demonstrate that the administration should have the ability to just fully run that police force. And of course, we've got that skepticism from the judge. There's a temporary arrangement there. So there's already frustration with the administration that they're not going to be able to do what they want with the DC police force. What Trump knows, what his White House knows, what his attorney general knows is that U.S. troops, on the other hand, under his command, he can say and do whatever he wants. That's their perspective. And so I think by arming them, they're taking that additional step to saying, we're eventually going to prove out the model here for why we won't need the local police forces to do the things we want to do. And keep in mind here, the D.C. law, the law about home rule in Washington, D.C., that allows them to take over the D.C. police force for a period of time is only one of the ways the president of the United States can use emergency powers to try to enhance command and control and increase security on the ground. So, I would be aware in the coming days and weeks of other powers that the president might try to invoke to continue that presence, to expand that presence. And I'll give you an example is, down at the southern border, when we used to have National Guard troops down there, often they were not armed either. They were there in a support support mission. And that's how this started off, which is usually the turnkey way you bring in the National Guard, is a support mission to go help with other functions that the gun-carrying law enforcement need to be freed up from. And instead, by arming them, they're showing that they eventually intend for these National Guard troops to be the ones enforcing the law on the ground. Now, that's not certain yet, but that's where I think this is headed.
One of the things that this reminds me of, especially, is Los Angeles, right? This is not the test case, right? We have seen this already before, and those National Guards troops had to be trained on how to deal with the population that was there, right? Because that's not exactly what they're, and the military folks, that's not exactly what they're trained for. I'm a military brat, I know this. But I also want to play congressional Republicans going after other democratically run cities, because this is clearly a trend and it seems purposeful. Let's listen.
What's happening in D.C., this is easy. President Trump is showing bold and strong leadership.
Hopefully, this is a harbinger of what we see in these liberally run cities across the country. We need to send in the troops, which is exactly what we're doing.
We're going to support doing this in other cities if it works out in Washington, D.C. I think that this is an experiment that's probably needed in a lot of the Democrat-run cities in America.
An experiment that's probably needed in a lot of Democrat-run cities in America. I remember when Republicans were the party of states' rights, right? DC's a little different, it ain't no state. But the other cities that they're talking about, those are in states where there are governors, where there are laws and how those governors are able to handle what's going on in their cities. That doesn't seem to be the case. What happened to states' rights? Where's that at?
I mean, the Republican Party isn't necessarily known for ideological consistency here, right?
Oh, what do you
mean? I know that's...
Well, at least not anymore.
Not anymore. But yeah, I mean, the interesting part of this is that this is clearly not about crime, right? Because if you look at Axios just did a study, right? 13 of the 20 U.S. cities with the highest homicide rates are in Republican states. And guess who isn't naming those Republican states? Donald, right? There's three things that these states have in common, these cities, right? Blue cities, blue states, black mayor. It's like they ran it through a chat GPT prompt. It was like, give me back the states, the cities that have these parameters, right? Because as we see, D.C. has a declining, violent crime rate, 30-year low, 26% down from this time last year to right now, right? And obviously with these National Guard troops and generally, it's illegal for them to do any civilian law enforcement, right, under the Posse Comitatus Act, right? So he's pushing the envelope here on that front, as Miles has outlined. But generally, it's authoritarian spectacle because he feels weak right now. And I really think that's important to frame. This man has a 37% approval rating in the latest Gallup, right? And this is 3 points away from his post-January 6th low of 34%. So Donald Trump is 3 points away from being at his absolute political low. Right? So that's the context from which this is happening. He's doing this authoritarian spectacle to deflect from his mounting scandals, to deflect from his weakening.
And the party's backing him.
And the party is backing him because they think they can make up for those losses through the gerrymandering.
Well, Miles, that gets to, my hobby horse here, especially when Donald Trump's approval ratings are mentioned. To Ahmed's point, Donald Trump is weak right now in the overall polls. But as you and I both know, Donald Trump couldn't care less about his standing in the overall polls. What he most cares about is his standing among Republicans, and especially his standing among MAGA Republicans. And last I saw, he is in the high 80s, low 90s still. Isn't that something we should keep in mind when we see him do things that, might seem extrajudicial, outside the bounds of the Constitution, dare say unlawful?
That's absolutely right. And in fact, if you go back 10 years, Donald Trump most frequently talks about those numbers that you mentioned, Jonathan. He would talk about the numbers of his approval in the Republican Party. And I can remember this in meetings and conversations with him, is he would talk about being more popular than Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan. Now, keep in mind, there were not public opinion polls during the time of Abraham Lincoln in the same way we have today, yet Donald Trump still felt like like his high 80s, low 90% approval in the Republican Party meant he was more popular than Lincoln and Reagan, and he used that comparison all the time. That's what he's paying attention to. That's also what he's going to be paying attention to when he decides whether or not this is a popular policy to deploy U.S. troops in American cities. And as you guys just saw with that montage, his core lieutenants out there in Congress and the administration are loving this. This is exactly what they want to see, and that's why I worry. I mean, Ahmed's right to note that the Posse Comitatus Act prevents these National Guard troops from enforcing domestic law, from going and arresting civilians, but not if Donald Trump goes and invokes something like the Insurrection Act. And this is on their dance card. I mean, listen to me here. The president wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. I stood in the room as he directed us years ago to invoke the Insurrection Act to give him the ability to use the U.S. military on U.S. soil for civilian law enforcement. We pushed back. We worked with the lawyers. We got Donald Trump to stay down. But this is a compulsive thought in his mind. So that's what we need to be prepared for. I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm saying I think it's quite likely that he ends up doing that, and we end up seeing this troop presence in U.S. cities be more than just a symbol.
National Guard presence in D.C. is set to increase in the coming days. Several Republican governors announced on Saturday that they will be deploying some of their state's National Guard troops to help Donald Trump's efforts in the nation's capital. Donald Trump's federal takeover of Washington, D.C.'s police force isn't just a test on the limits of his authority. It's a show of force in the name of public safety. Trump is using crime in D.C. and residents' fear as an excuse to deploy the National Guard, the FBI, DHS, and ICE to the city. Explain that to me, why ICE is involved in this. There was a time when Trump had the opportunity to quell a massive crime spree in D.C., when an angry, violent mob descended on the nation's capital to disrupt America's democratic process. Remember that? The so-called law and order president could have sent the National Guard in immediately, but he held off. Video released during the January 6th hearing shows Democrats Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer pleading with the Pentagon to send in the National Guard. Troops arrived only hours later. Dozens of police officers were injured. 5 died in the days and weeks that followed. Veteran Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Fanone nearly died defending the Capitol from rioters. He suffered burns, a heart attack, and brain injuries. According to Fanone, the federal takeover, quote, makes no sense. Federal law states that the president can only take control of D.C.'s law enforcement on an emergency basis, and there's no emergency happening on the streets of D.C. right now. Sure, there's crime, homelessness, and other problems that you see in any city, but the crime rate has actually been steadily falling. Trump's not trying to fight crime. He's trying to assert dominance, end quote. Michael Fanone joins me now. He's a retired D.C. Metropolitan Police officer. He served 20 years in Washington, D.C.'s police department. He helped defend the Capitol on January the 6th. He's also the author of Hold the Line, The Insurrection and One Cop's Battle for America's Soul. Michael, great to have you on the show. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
I think you would agree. All Americans would agree. We certainly don't want to be put on the wrong side of saying crime is bad and we'd like to fight all crime in cities. But there has been a trend in major cities, and particularly in Washington, D.C., toward lower crime. If it wasn't an emergency in Donald Trump's first term, it's certainly less of an emergency now.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying there is crime in Washington, D.C., and there is a crime problem in Washington, D.C. And I see the president's response to that. I look at it in 2 parts. But first, I want to remind Americans, I know it's been talked about a lot this week, but it bears repeating, especially from myself. On January 6, 2021, when 15,000 Trump supporters marched on the Capitol, stormed the Capitol, and assaulted law enforcement officers, Donald Trump didn't see fit to call in the National Guard then and sat idly by for hours while officers like myself were being beaten and almost killed. That being said, he now feels as though he should deploy the National Guard. And the issue that I take with that is there is no crime, there's no spike in crime that we're experiencing in Washington, D.C. And even then, what is it exactly that the National Guard will do to quell that other than the optics of this occupying force, which I think most Americans resent. I certainly would resent that if I saw this show of force in my community And I know a lot of D.C. residents that I've talked to over the past weeks certainly resent seeing this in their community, and it does nothing. Having armored vehicles parked on, the National Mall does nothing except create this illusion of, or the idea of fear and an occupying force. Then if you talk about the way that Donald Trump is now deploying these federal agencies, the three-letter agencies, ATF, DEA, FBI, there is a place. I was a federal task force officer. I worked alongside of federal partners as a Metropolitan Police officer. There is a place for that. That place is not having roving bands of officers in tactical gear aimlessly walking around, Georgetown or downtown Washington, D.C., again, creating, the optics of an occupying force and fear. The community policing model was born out of this.
Yes.
And it's an imperfect model.
But you're trained for it. You're trying to get, everybody's trying to get better at it, right? It's imperfect, but it's the idea that that's a different role than the National Guard has.
Well, it comes from, the idea that these agencies are charged with keeping the community safe. And citizens should have a say-so in how they are policed. And so citizens don't want to feel as though they're occupied. They want to be safe, but they don't want to feel like they're being, occupied by an army. And that's what you have now taking over in D.C. And it's not an efficient use of those resources. They could be better used. Federal agencies do a few things really, really well. They know how to conduct long-term investigations, and they bring with them federal resources, technology, money that local police departments don't have access to. Yeah. And so that's how these, agents should be used to bolster these, federal task force, not out there walking around harassing citizens and pissing people off who have to, are trying to go about their daily business and see this in their streets.
The other question I've got is ICE. It feels like this all feels like the National Guard and ICE. It all feels like Donald Trump trying to sort of normalize the idea that his police are in charge, not your police, not the D.C. police that are answerable to the city council of D.C., his police who are answerable to him. There's some bad precedents to that in history.
I agree. And I think it's important, you hit the nail right on the head. ICE is Donald Trump's police department. When the American people think federal agencies, they should separate the FBI, the DEA, yes, the ATF from ICE.
Yes.
The behavior that I have seen displayed by ICE agents over the past, month or so is unjustifiable. I'm sure there are some ICE agents that are out there that, are just trying to do their job. But again, I look at it as though, complicity in this, silence is complicity. Quit your job. And that would be my message to everyone in the law enforcement community that's being co-opted by the Trump administration to do things that are immoral, unethical, and in many cases unconstitutional. Yep. Quit your job. There's a lot of other jobs out there. I quit my job at the police department, and I got to tell you, when it comes to law enforcement, the grass is always greener somewhere else.
Yep. Michael, thank you for your service to the country, your continued service to the country. Michael Fanone is a retired D.C. Metro police officer. He's the co-author of an important book, Hold the Line, The Insurrection and One Cop's Battle for America's Soul. Bill, I've spent the last few hours trying to understand what's happening tomorrow because Donald Trump, there's no world in which Donald Trump, he doesn't like multilateral meetings because he likes to be able to bully people on their own. So the idea that you got the head of NATO, the head of the EU, major prime ministers and presidents from Europe coming into the White House to basically, let's just be clear, I hope they're there to figure out a peace agreement, but they're basically there to say, you're not going to push Ukraine around. I think this is a fascinating development. I don't think it's one that the White House necessarily would have planned, but what do you make of it?
Well, I'm really glad that all these people are there because we absolutely can't have a repeat of that unbelievably scandalous, terrible meeting that Donald Trump had with Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office, where he and J.D. Vance verbally and practically physically attacked Zelensky. We just can't have that. So the fact that they're showing up is very helpful. I think there's one thing that's very important that everybody needs to understand is that it kind of looks to me, and I think it looks to many others, like at the meeting in Alaska, none of us were present in their meeting, but it looks like Donald Trump has accepted some version of Putin's, quote, peace plan. And the purpose of this meeting was to then present it to Zelensky. And of course, the Vladimir Putin's proposal is a totally unacceptable proposal for Ukraine, for Europe, for just about anybody else. And Zelensky will have to be in a position to reject it. And so the fact that he's not going to then be in a position to reject it by himself, but be in a position to reject it with the collective voices of NATO, the European Union, the UK, et cetera, at least puts him on firmer ground to reject it, because that has to be where this thing is going.
I will say, though, Vladimir, at some point, there's a lot of firepower going to the White House tomorrow. Is there a world, because Steve Witkoff, who is apparently the president's negotiator for everything, he's gone to Russia 5 times to meet with Putin. Putin actually called him out by name to say he's welcome to keep coming, because meetings with a guy like Steve Witkoff are good for Putin. Nothing gets accomplished. As I said yesterday, it's a lot of shuttle and not very much diplomacy. But is there a world in which Witkoff says we are going to agree to give Ukraine Article 5-like protections without NATO membership? Sounds like it means in exchange for some territory. Is there a world in which that's viable and useful to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we have to be really careful about putting any weight on deals that involve land swaps for anything else when people are dealing with dictators, aggressors, and bullies, like as Vladimir Putin is. Because, and again, I keep going back to the lessons of history. The great 19th century Russian historian Vasily Kluchevsky once observed that history does not teach anyone anything, but it punishes those who fail to learn its lessons. Well, isn't the lesson of the 1938 Munich Agreement enough for today's world leaders? Adolf Hitler said that Sudetenland was his last territorial claim in Europe. And then after that, again, after that piece of paper that Neville Chamberlain waved saying this is peace in our time, this was it. Europe was at peace. Everything was fine. Everything was secure. It was, I believe, just 11 months between the signing of the Munich Agreement and the start of World War II. So, again, we are in the 21st century, not in the 17th, and we should not be talking about handing one country's territory to another. This is something that is in complete violation of international law as it stands. With an added irony is that this month, August, is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Helsinki Final Act, when countries across Europe and North America, including the United States of America and the then Soviet Union, agreed that there should be no forceful change of borders on European territory by force. And yet that is essentially exactly what is being talked about. But also, if you want to specifically talk about security guarantees, let's not forget that there was already a document that provided...
They had one, yeah, the Munich, the Budapest Agreement.
To Ukraine. Yes, on the 5th of December, 1994, in Budapest, Hungary, several countries, including the United States of America and the United Kingdom, gave security assurances to Ukraine when it gave up its nuclear weapons in return for these international supposed guarantees. Well, what did these countries do when Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, which was the first case when one European country forcibly seized territory from another since the end of the Second World War? Essentially, they did nothing. And I think the attitude of the Kremlin and the attitude of Vladimir Putin going into this whole process, they were really on display at that meeting in Anchorage when, well, first of all, just on the outward trappings. I mean, I'm sure you remember the pictures of Sergei Lavrov, Putin's foreign minister, arriving in Anchorage with a T-shirt saying USSR in it. Margarita Simonyan, who's head of the Kremlin propaganda network RT Russia Today, boasted, tweeted on her social media that Russian state propagandists, the so-called journalists from Russian state media, while they were on a plane on the way to Alaska, they were served chicken Kiev for dinner. I mean, can you think of anything more brazen, anything more emboldened from these people? And also, it's that Putin did not consider it necessary to make any gestures of goodwill going into the meeting. He got it for nothing. There was no ceasefire, not even for a few days, not even a partial one. There was no release of any Ukrainian civilian captives, for example, or any Russian political prisoners who are sitting in jail because they opposed this war. There were 3 Nobel Peace Prize laureates who called on Putin in advance of this meeting as a gesture of goodwill to release some political prisoners, some Ukrainian civilian captives. Nothing of the sort has happened. You know, I've seen in some media, including American media, there were comparisons of the Anchorage meeting between Trump and Putin to the Reykjavik meeting in 1986 between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Well, frankly, nothing could be further from the truth, because yes, Reagan still had to deal with the Soviets, but he did it with a position of strength and principle. And nothing could be more different from the current administration. You remember the condition that Ronald Reagan gave for even coming to Reykjavik to meet Gorbachev. He said the Soviets had to release Yuri Orlov, who was a leading dissident at the time, the founding chairman of the Moscow-Helsinki group, who spent years and years in the Gulag and was at the time in exile in eastern Siberia. Reagan said, I'm not even coming to Reykjavik unless Gorbachev releases Orlov. And guess what? He did release him. And Reagan met with Orlov first, and only then came to meet with a Soviet leader. Now, this is what the policy based on strength and principle is, and this has nothing to do with what we're seeing today.
Bill, when you were talking to American legislators about the Magnitsky Act, you not only met with, but had universal support almost from Democrats and Republicans. In fact, Republican support for this was very strong. The idea of Republicans' support for standing up in favor of human rights and against an adversarial Russia was very strong. Where is this gone? What has happened here that all of these things that Vladimir just describes happened in Anchorage on Friday, and not a peep from anyone about how we welcome this guy with a literal red carpet?
Yeah, well, you make a really good point. And in fact, I would argue that when I was pushing for the Magnitsky Act, the Republicans were more robust than the Democrats in being tough on Russia. And by the way, guess who one of my biggest allies was in the campaign for the Magnitsky Act? None other than, at the time, Senator Marco Rubio. He was the guy that we would go to when Putin would do bad stuff to get a backbone from the Senate. He was the guy who was the most hawkish when it came to all this Russian nastiness. And so it's interesting because I've been reading all the news very carefully, and a poll came out yesterday about the public opinion of Vladimir Putin, and about 85% of Republicans think he's a bad guy. I think it goes up to 92% for Democrats. And so it's not as if in America the public opinion is on Putin's side.
Right.
And in fact, a majority of Americans even support, both on the certainly on the Republican side and definitely on the Democrat side, more aid for Ukraine. And so what we're seeing right now is a foreign policy towards Russia that's being completely cooked up by Donald Trump himself, that doesn't reflect the public opinion of the Americans. It doesn't reflect the private opinions of any of these Republican senators. I can tell you that they're all trying to figure out how to maneuver in this world. But what's happening is that they're completely scared of crossing Donald Trump. And so we end up in a situation where none of the checks and balances are working. The entire political process is being driven by Donald Trump for reasons that are mysterious to anybody who's watching this. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any geopolitical sense. All America's allies are flying, dropping all their plans to fly to Washington to try to convince Trump to do the right thing. All Americans are on the side of the Ukrainians and against Vladimir Putin. And so what you have is the policy of one man, and he's trying to strong arm and gaslight everybody into believing that this meeting was a 10 out of 10 and this is the right approach and that capitulation is the right strategy. And it's obviously not. And I can only hope that he, as inconsistent as Trump has been in many other policies, that whatever he had decided to do in Anchorage, he'll change his mind on Monday and we'll see something that's a lot more palatable to the world and to the American people when he meets with Zelensky and this group of international leaders.
Well, we want the museums to treat our country fairly. We want the museums to talk about the history of our country in a fair manner, not in a woke manner or in a racist manner, which is what many of them, not all of them, but many of them are doing.
President Trump there outlining his motives in ordering a review of exhibitions and materials at 8 Smithsonian museums, including the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the National Museum of the American Indian. The White House says it plans to replace what it considers divisive or ideologically driven language with unifying, historically accurate and constructive descriptions. Well, joining me now is our friend Eddie Glaude, James S. McDonald, distinguished professor at Princeton University and an MSNBC contributor and analyst. And you know, Eddie, I'm just guessing that you've got something to say about this because you are a history professor. So who gets to decide what is divisive versus historically accurate, not to mention the president's depictions of what is, quote, woke and racist?
Well, look, first of all, it's always great to see you, Alex. And, we're dealing with this internet, so I hope I can get through this. But I think it's really important for us to understand what Donald Trump is up to. I think it's very clear that he's trying to tell a story of America that coincides with his own political ambitions, his own conception of America as a white republic. And so, unlike other presidents who believe that we were always already on the road to the more perfect union, Donald Trump believes that the country's perfection was evidenced in its founding. So we can't tell a story about our failings because those stories call into question our inherent goodness and our divine mission. So he's seeking a history that confirms his politics in so many ways, Alex. I think it's a politics that's rooted in a white nationalist project, and we need to call it for what it is.
I was talking with someone off camera about this, and they said, here's the thing. You don't have to really focus on this too much because if he does make changes, that very quickly they can be undone once he's out of office. Does that give you any, he's going to do what he's going to do?
No, usually when we've been in these sorts of patterns as a country, they last for 50 plus years. The historical analogy to make would be to the end of radical Reconstruction, its collapse in 1875 and 1876. And what we know is that doesn't get undone until 1954 with the Brown v. Board decision. And what's really distinctive about the collapse of radical Reconstruction is the lost cause, its redemption. It's the very ways in which the nation tells itself its story. And so there are moments actually in the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, in the 1920s, Alex, where there were school districts that refused to teach Reconstruction. They refused to teach slavery. And so this is a kind of repetition and echoing, a rhyming past. And so we just can't assume that we get the back of Donald Trump's head and we're going to be in a better position. No, because Donald Trump is just the tip of the rot. The rot is much deeper in the country, it seems to me.
Speaking of schools, Eddie, last week the White House asked colleges for admissions data. But as Trump seeks to eliminate any consideration of race in college admissions, critics and supporters alike are calling him out for not tackling, say, legacy admissions, the edge that's given to the children of alumni or relatives of wealthy donors. So is that blatantly unfair?
It's not only blatantly unfair, it also reveals what's really motivating the policy. The problem is always with black students or brown students who get admission. White students or Asian students, they don't get a seat because these unqualified black students are getting seats. Why is that necessarily the case? About a range of folks, right? I'm sorry, this is this internet. I'm sorry. But why aren't we talking about athletes keep going. Others? Right? Why aren't we talking about these other ways in which classes are constituted? Instead, it's always these black folk. Trump is trying to, in so many ways, cut the pipeline off by cutting off access to these extraordinary institutions that give us social capital.